India should be concerned. Aviation giant Boeing agrees to a guilty plea for the plane crashes that killed more than 300 people. Is it too little, too late? There's a debate on the job situation in India. What does the data say? A report on terror attacks in Jammu and Kashmir. Is Laos the latest country caught in China's debt trap? Why Singapore has put insects on the menu? And what is digital hoarding? Are you a hoarder? We'll talk about this and more. The headlines first. The Pakistani government authorizes its spy agency, the ISI, to trace and intercept calls and messages, saying that the move is in the interest of national security. This decision by the Shehbaz Sharif government will tighten the noose on the opposition as well as social media platforms in Pakistan. Moody's downgrades Kenya's debt rating into junk territory. The credit ratings agency cites Kenya's inability to reduce its debt for the downgrade. The William Ruto government had proposed tax hikes but had to abandon it after widespread protest. Kenya is one of the largest economies in East Africa. Relief for Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Prosecutors dropped charges against him in the political fund scandal over lack of evidence. Several members from Kishida's ruling party have been raided, questioned and arrested in this case. Kishida's public approval rating has also slumped to a record low. Slovakia's Prime Minister returns to work after almost 2 months. In the month of May, a gunman shot the Prime Minister 4 times. The 59-year-old leader had to undergo 2 lengthy surgeries. The shooter is currently in custody awaiting trial. Greece records its hottest June in more than 6 decades. The Mediterranean nation has been battling heat waves and wildfires. Scientists say climate change is making these weather events longer lasting and more intense. And it's official. Indian Cricket Board names Gautam Gambhir as the head coach of the men's team. The former opener takes over from Rahul Dravid. Gambhir was part of the Indian team which won the World Cup in 2011. The last 24 hours have been quite eventful. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin have met twice, first for dinner on Monday and then today for the annual India-Russia summit. They reviewed the entire spectrum of the bilateral relationship, from the war in Ukraine to defense, trade and energy. All of it was discussed. They resolved some pressing issues and the visit ended on a high for the Indian Prime Minister. He was honoured with Russia's highest civilian award, the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle. He was awarded for his contributions to the India-Russia relationship. In fact, the award was announced in 2019, but the ceremony could not happen then because Prime Minister Modi had to postpone his visit. So he was formally given the honour today. Russia has conferred the same award on Xi Jinping as well. The Chinese president received it in 2017. 2 years later, Moscow honoured Prime Minister Modi. And by doing this, Putin is sending an important message that his relationship with India is as important as his ties with China. And the West has been watching these developments closely, not without sharp reactions. Tonight, we'll tell you all about it. The day began with formal engagements, the India-Russia delegation-level talks, co-chaired by Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. The tone for today's summit was set last evening when Putin hosted Modi for dinner. This was an informal meeting, the dinner meeting, at the Russian President estate outside Moscow. And the chemistry between the two leaders was evident. President Putin welcomed Prime Minister Modi with a hug. There were several such moments. The Russian president took the Indian Prime Minister on a tour of his dacha or estate. and they were seen riding a golf cart together. Putin even introduced Modi to his pet horses. Social media was full of memes comparing this reception to the long table treatment that Western leaders get in Moscow of late. Evidently, the Russian leader attaches great significance to his relationship with India, and this was abundantly clear when both leaders sat down for discussions.
आदरणीय प्रधानमंत्री जी, परम दोस्त, आपका स्वागत है, हार्दिक स्वागत है। आपको देखने से मुझे बड़ी खुशी है।
Официальные разговоры у нас состоятся завтра.
औपचारिक बातचीत कल होने वाली है।
А сегодня мы можем в такой домашней обстановке спокойно поговорить, наверное, о тех же вопросах, но неофициально. Но вначале хотел бы вас поздравить с переизбранием на должность премьер-министра. У вас свои идеи, вы очень энергичный человек, вы умеете добиваться результатов в интересах Индии и индийского народа.
तरह के घर आना वो अपने आप में एक बहुत बड़ा खुशी का अवसर होता है और मुझे आपने अपने घर पर निमंत्रित किया और आज की शाम हम साथ में गप्पे मारे, इसलिए आपने तय किया। इस कार्यक्रम की रचना के लिए और मुझे घर पे बुलाने के लिए मैं आपका बहुत बहुत आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ।
After this exchange, Modi and Putin were left alone with their translators for a freewheeling chat. They discussed important issues like the war in Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi told President Putin a solution will not be found on the battlefield. And this is a very significant statement. It is a direct appeal from India to end the war in Ukraine. It is also in line with what Modi told Putin back in 2022 when they met in Uzbekistan on the sidelines of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. That's when Modi told Putin, and I'm quoting, "This is not the era of war." And yesterday, he urged the Russian leader to explore diplomatic options. The same message was reiterated during the formal summit today as well.
एक्सेलेंसी, एक मित्र के नाते मैंने हमेशा कहा है कि हमारी भावी पीढ़ी के उज्जवल भविष्य के लिए शांति सर्वाधिक आवश्यक है। लेकिन मैं ये भी जानता हूं कि युद्ध के मैदान में समाधान संभव नहीं होते। बम, बंदूक और गोलियों के बीच समाधान और शांति वार्ताएं सफल नहीं होती हैं और हमने वार्ता के माध्यम से ही शांति के रास्ते अपनाने होंगे।
So India is pushing for peace and talks. India is also clear that these talks must include Russia, which explains why New Delhi did not endorse the Swiss declaration last month. I'm referring to the Ukraine Peace Summit. Switzerland had hosted it in June. More than 90 countries participated in the summit. India too sent a representative, but Russia was not invited to this summit in Switzerland. So India refused to sign the joint communique. It said that there can be no meaningful and sustainable resolution without Moscow's presence. This was India's message to the West. At the same time, it is asking Russia to abide by the United Nations Charter, to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Prime Minister Modi addressed this with President Putin, and that's the biggest highlight of this visit. He also raised the issue of the repatriation of Indian citizens, those serving in Russian forces. Reports say there are at least 40 such Indians stuck in Russia. They were tricked by agents into joining the Russian forces. And India has been trying to secure their release. Yesterday, there was a breakthrough. President Putin agreed to discharge all Indian citizens. There were agreements on some other key issues as well, like on trade, where both countries have set an ambitious target. Bilateral trade currently stands at $65 billion. They want to raise it all the way up to $100 billion by 2030. And this trade relationship is heavily skewed in Russia's favor, mainly due to India's oil purchases. We buy a lot of oil from Russia. To fix this imbalance, India has sought greater market access from Russia. On the defense front, India had a specific concern. We talked about this yesterday. The delay in deliveries. Many Russian supplies are running late. They're yet to deliver 2 S-400 missile defense systems. Prime Minister Modi is believed to have raised this, asking for speedy deliveries. India is also investing more in its partnership with Russia. Today, the Prime Minister made an announcement that India will open 2 more consulates in Russia, in Kazan and Yekaterinburg. So overall, it was a productive visit for Prime Minister Modi. India managed to secure its strategic interests with a vital partner. India also asserted its strategic autonomy and asked for an end to the war. But not everyone is thrilled about this visit. Like the United States, which is reacting on expected lines, yesterday it said that it was concerned about Prime Minister Modi's engagements with Russia.
There's another visitor in Moscow today, Prime Minister Modi of India. Obviously India has a long-standing relationship with Russia. What do you think of the timing of this right before the NATO summit and in light of what's going on?
We would urge India, as we do any country when it engages with Russia. India is a strategic partner with whom we engage in a full and frank dialogue, and that includes on our concerns about their relationship with Russia.
Ukraine's President Zelensky added to this. He called Putin a quote-unquote criminal. He said Prime Minister Modi's engagements undermine the peace efforts for Ukraine. In a statement, Zelensky referred to yesterday's airstrikes on Kiev, where a children's hospital was hit. But both the US and Ukraine spoke too soon. They should have waited for the Indian Prime Minister to speak, because he too raised yesterday's airstrikes with Putin.
मानवता में विश्वास करने वाला हर व्यक्ति जब जानहानि होती है तब बहुत पीड़ित होता है, लेकिन उसमें भी जब मासूम बच्चों की कत्ल होती है, मासूम बच्चों को मरते हुए देखते हैं, तब हृदय छलनी हो जाता है और वो दर्द बहुत भयानक होता है। और इस विषय में भी आपसे विस्तार से चर्चा हुई।
Now that's a strong message. Clearly, India is advocating for the protection of civilians in Ukraine, especially the children. Prime Minister Modi is probably the first world leader to take up yesterday's attack directly with the Russian president. He also tackled another tricky issue, India's oil purchases from Russia. Prime Minister Modi countered the Western criticism of these purchases.
दुनिया के अनेक देशों के नागरिकों को पेट्रोल डीजल के कारण बहुत बड़े संकट से गुजरना पड़ा और आज भी गुजरना पड़ रहा है, लेकिन हमारे उस कारोबार के कारण हम भारत के नागरिकों को पेट्रोल डीजल के इस मार से बचा पाए, इन्फ्लेशन से बचा पाए और स्टेबिलिटी भी ला पाए। इसके लिए भी मैं आपका आभार व्यक्त करता हूं।
In diplomacy, the choice of words is everything. Prime Minister Modi's statements demonstrate how skillfully India balances its ties between Russia and the West. It's a tough balance to maintain, but India must do it to protect its national interest, and so far New Delhi has done it well. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi made an appeal to Vladimir Putin. He asked Putin to choose diplomacy and dialogue. He said there was no solution on the battlefield. Either Putin disagrees or Moscow had already set a plan in motion, because yesterday Russia launched an attack on Ukraine, one of the largest attacks in months. Dozens of missiles, including hypersonic ones, were launched at Ukraine. Multiple cities were targeted, including Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Russia says it was going for military facilities in response to an earlier Ukrainian attack. It was supposed to be a show of force. And here's why I say this. The attack took place yesterday, a day before a summit was supposed to begin in Washington, D.C. A NATO summit celebrating 75 years of the alliance. All 32 NATO members are sending their representatives. And they had planned to send a message of support for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine won't become a NATO member, not yet anyway, but the group was expected to talk about the way forward for Kiev. It was also going to pledge more aid worth about $43 billion. This will be a commitment for 2025, $43 billion. NATO is also expected to take a more hands-on approach in Ukraine by directly providing weapons and training. Currently, this is organized by individual NATO member states. But now NATO, the group itself, will arrange weapons and they will organize training programs. And this brings NATO a step closer to direct confrontation with Russia. Moscow knows this. Listen to the Kremlin spokesperson.
Russia will follow the NATO summit with maximum attention. You know that the North Atlantic Alliance is the alliance which considers the Russian Federation its enemy, an adversary. This is the alliance which repeatedly and openly declared its aim to strategically defeat Russia on the battlefield. This is the alliance which is directly involved in the Ukrainian conflict, on the Ukraine side. Therefore, we will be following very closely the rhetoric which is about to take place, the negotiations and decisions that will be adopted and put on paper.
Moscow is keeping an eye on NATO, so the timing of the latest attack was no coincidence. It was supposed to send a message. However, things may not have gone according to plan because Russia fired dozens of missiles at Ukraine across multiple cities, and in Kiev, a missile fell on a children's hospital, leading to chaos and a frantic rescue operation. Russia says this was not its handiwork. It says that a Ukrainian air defense missile hit the hospital, a Western NASAMS missile. Kiev denies this, of course. It says this is the missile that hit the hospital, a Russian Kh-101 rocket. Kiev has released these photos to incriminate Russia. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Poland signing a new defense pact. That's when he got news of the Russian attack and he was quick to react.
As of now, we know of 27 people killed in this strike. I would like to ask for and I thank for this opportunity. I would like to ask everyone present to pay tribute with a minute of silence.
Zelensky called for a moment of silence and then he loudly blamed Russia for the hospital attack. His Western allies believe him. The global condemnation has been swift. The United Nations Secretary General said the strike was, quote-unquote, particularly shocking. The UN Security Council called an emergency meeting to discuss the attack. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden also condemned Russia. He said the attack was a, quote-unquote, horrific reminder of Russia's brutality. Russia wanted to send a message to the West, but it's unlikely that it wanted to galvanize them. So the hospital strike seems to have been a mistake, one that the West will no doubt use to rally support for Ukraine. Russia's show of force seems to have backfired, and we'll have to wait and see how NATO capitalizes on this. For our next story, let's look at Russia's neighbor Belarus. It is playing host to Chinese troops. Why? Because of a joint military drill. It is codenamed Eagle Assault. The drill began on Monday. It will continue for 11 days. Now, this is a joint drill. It includes tactical operations like night landings, overcoming water barriers, and urban combat training. Troops from both countries, China and Belarus, will work as one unit. But what are these sudden drills about? Why with China? Is the timing suspicious? And is it a sign of something bigger? Let's look at all these questions one by one. Last August, the Chinese defense minister was in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. He met President Alexander Lukashenko. The two countries agreed to conduct more drills, and looks like they followed up. Their last joint drills were in 2018 in eastern China, but this is the first time that Beijing has sent troops to Belarus. China, of course, is playing it down, saying that this is part of an annual plan. They call it anti-terrorist training. But is it really? The answer lies in the location. Let me pull up a map for you. The drills are happening here in the city of Brest. It's obviously in Belarus. But look closely at the location. Brest lies just 5 kilometers away from Poland. And not just that, it's located barely 50 kilometers from Ukraine. And what's common between these two nations? One is a member of the NATO, Poland. The other wants to join it, Ukraine. The other point to note is the timing of the drills. They began on the eve of the NATO's 75th anniversary. NATO leaders are meeting in Washington to discuss the future of the alliance, and Beijing chose this very moment to flex its muscle at a NATO border. It also coincides with an important visit. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Poland. We just told you about this. He met with the Polish Prime Minister. He also signed a security agreement. So the timing is not mere coincidence. It's about sending a message to the West. Now, China and Belarus have long been cordial. But in the last few years, they've deepened ties. Beijing describes it, and listen to this. This is how Beijing describes the relationship: an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. It's a mouthful. It's also a rare term. In fact, China uses this description for only one other nation, and that is Pakistan. So Belarus is quite important to China, and vice versa. In 2023, President Alexander Lukashenko visited China not once but twice. And this year, Belarus joined the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's the 10th member of this group. So it looks like China and Belarus do have an unbreakable friendship. That's what Xi Jinping likes to call it, an unbreakable friendship. But let's also give credit where it's due. There's one country that links both Minsk and Beijing, and that's Russia. Belarus is a critical ally of Moscow. It has backed the Ukraine invasion. Meanwhile, China and Russia have what they call a no-limits partnership. They're like comrades in arms. Recently, Putin won his 5th term as president. And guess which was the first country that he visited? China. So Moscow is like the glue in this friendship. Does that make these drills a power play? A message to the West? It appears so. The making of the China-Russia-Belarus alliance, a new axis against the West. Belarus has long been a key ally in Russia's war. It allowed Moscow to use its border as a launch pad. Russian nukes are deployed in Belarus, so it's an active participant in the war. But China has long avoided this. It has refused to condemn Russia, but it has also tried to appear neutral. It has avoided staunch support for one side, while secretly also helping Russia. Beijing has even called for peace. But with these drills, the mask is slipping. China is finally giving up its garb of neutrality and clearly picking sides. We've just seen what Chinese troops are up to. Now let's look at their leader. He's hosting an important guest this week, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. She arrived in Beijing yesterday, and she will be leaving tomorrow night. It was originally supposed to be a 4-day trip, but it seems to have been cut short, not because of any issues though. It just looks like Sheikh Hasina has been quick to wrap up business. She's no stranger to Beijing. It's her 5th trip to China. She last visited in 2019, so she knows the ropes and she knows how to get the job done. Today she took part in a trade summit dubbed the Rise of the Bengal Tiger. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina attended this event and walked away with 16 deals, 16 MOUs, memorandums of understanding. Just 4 of these are worth about $500 million. They cover a number of sectors: fintech, electric vehicles, solar energy, textiles. Chinese firms are investing in all these industries in Bangladesh, and Sheikh Hasina will be thrilled. After all, this was why she went to Beijing, to secure Chinese investments. In fact, China has been investing in Bangladesh for years. But the cooperation ramped up in 2016 after Xi Jinping visited Dhaka. Sino-Bangladesh ties were upgraded that year to a strategic cooperation partnership. And China has been pouring money into Bangladesh ever since. Today's trade summit was an extension of this policy. And we'll see more of the same tomorrow. Sheikh Hasina will be meeting Xi Jinping tomorrow afternoon, and she will have a bilateral with China's Premier Li Qiang. It will be a delegation-level bilateral. Bangladesh is expected to walk away with even more MOUs, more deals, and possibly another upgrade in its relationship with China. The ties might reach the next level to become a comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership. It's basically symbolic. It's a symbol of growing ties, even if it doesn't change much on the ground. These are the expected results of Sheikh Hasina's visit to Beijing. But the trip itself raises some questions, like why is Bangladesh cozying up to China? What is China's angle here? What do they stand to gain? And how should India view this flourishing relationship? We'll start with Bangladesh. The country was once known for its poverty, but over the years, it has been developing and developing fast. It is now neck and neck with India in terms of GDP per capita. Between 2018 and 2023, Bangladesh was actually ahead of India. But their growth has now slowed down a bit, which is why Dhaka is looking for more investments. It wants to add more fuel to its growth story. And that is why it is turning to Beijing and its deep pockets. The next question was about China. What's in it for them? Well, China is always looking to invest and then exploit. It is known as debt trap diplomacy, a term that is synonymous with China these days. Bangladesh is another potential mark, another country to fleece. But that's not all. Bangladesh is located in South Asia with access to the Bay of Bengal. It is a strategic location for both trade and military purposes. And China has been ramping up both sets of ties with Bangladesh, trade and military. Beijing seeks to expand its influence across the world, and Bangladesh may eventually serve as a gateway to the Bay of Bengal. It seems like China is playing the long game here, biding its time, waiting to take advantage. That is the Chinese angle. The third question was about India. How should India see the China-Bangladesh ties? Well, New Delhi should obviously be wary. India doesn't want to wake up one day with Chinese military bases in the Bay of Bengal. But that's not the immediate problem. For now, Bangladesh shows no signs of forsaking its friendship with India. Sheikh Hasina is an astute politician. She came to India twice last month. Once for Prime Minister Narendra Modi's swearing-in ceremony, and then for a bilateral. During her second trip, India and Bangladesh signed 10 pacts. Not a bad haul. Sheikh Hasina seems to be balancing ties with both India and China. Bangladesh is walking away with the best deals from both sides. Now let's talk about Boeing. It is one of the biggest aviation companies in the world, but in the last few years, it's become a dreaded name in aviation. 2 crashes, multiple investigations, and no accountability later, Boeing has now agreed to a guilty plea. It charges the company with criminal conspiracy. What's it about? The probe was linked to the 2 737 MAX crashes, the crashes that killed 346 people. Boeing will now have to pay a fine of $243 million, but by doing this, it can avoid the spectacle of a criminal trial, which raises the question, is this fair? Is this enough? Or is Boeing too big to be held accountable? Our next report tells you.
It was a normal day for United Flight 1001. It was set to take off from Los Angeles. It was heading to Denver, but disaster struck just moments after takeoff. The landing gear wheel fell off. No one was injured. The plane went on to land safely. It's not the first time this has happened. In March, a similar incident happened to another United Airlines jet. It took off from San Francisco, but mid-air, the plane lost a tire. It landed on a car window. Thankfully, no one was hurt. The plane landed safely at Los Angeles. Both these planes were Boeing aircraft. The latest incident comes at a time when Boeing has agreed to plead guilty in a probe into 2 fatal 737 crashes. The first was in 2018. It involved Lion Air Flight 610. 189 people lost their lives. The second was just 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. It crashed right after takeoff, killing 157 people. Both the planes were Boeing 737 MAXes. Soon, a probe began into the 2 crashes. Investigators found 2 main things. First, Boeing cut corners in designing the plane. And second, the company deceived regulators. Boeing was accused of risking the lives of passengers. So, in 2021, the company agreed to a settlement. It was worth $2.5 billion, but the company avoided criminal prosecution. Boeing promised to do better, but a recent spate of incidents don't indicate that. On the 5th of January this year, a Boeing 737-9 made an emergency landing. Why? Because the door plug blew out. There was a gaping hole in the plane in the middle of the air. In May, the US Department of Justice started probing Boeing. It found that the company broke the terms of the 2021 settlement. But Boeing seems to have found a way out. It has applied for a guilty plea. Boeing has agreed to pay a $243 million penalty. It's agreed to independent monitoring. The board of directors will also meet the families of the victims. They will invest $455 million in safety.
I would like to speak directly to those who lost loved ones on Lion Air Flight 610 and the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. I would like to apologize on behalf of all of our Boeing associates spread throughout the world, past and present, for your losses. They're gut-wrenching. And I apologize for the grief that we have caused. And I want you to know we are totally committed in their memory to work and focus on safety for as long as we're employed by Boeing. So again, I'm sorry.
But is that enough? The world has two main aircraft manufacturers. One is Airbus. The other is Boeing. The company is also among the top 5 US defense contractors. It employs 170,000 people. So Boeing is one of America's biggest companies. Right now, the company has orders for over 6,000 jets. That means it'll be in production for years. The business is not shutting down anytime soon. Also, in 2022, Boeing got over $14 billion worth of US defense contracts. Basically, it is too big to fail. So, is a penalty of $243 million sufficient? In the last 2 decades, all Boeing has done is chase profit, overlooking safety, which has led to the death of 346 people. Boeing has promised to do better, but that cannot be the end of accountability for the aviation giant.
Reports had surfaced about Indians who had fallen prey to job frauds, were tricked and forced by scammers to fight for the Russian army, which allows recruits from other countries. So far, 4 Indians have been killed in the Russian-Ukraine war. 10 of them have returned to the country, but about 35 to 40 Indians are still believed to be stuck in Russia. And this is why the India's foreign ministry has earlier said that it has been pressing very hard to bring back these recruits. And in fact, Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar had said that the issue is of very deep concern for India. They had been engaging with Russia for the past few months for a headway, because the recruitment of Indian nationals in the Russian army is in a conflict situation, is not in consonance with the India-Russia diplomatic partnership. That is what Indian Foreign Ministry has been maintaining. So this breakthrough now coming during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia will be seen as a major diplomatic breakthrough.
Right, Aman. Please stay with us. Payal also continues to stay with us on the broadcast. Payal, why exactly having a very strong bond and a bonhomie with Russia at this point of time so important for India, also considering a couple of, strained border relations with rest of the countries?
Well, of course, India's visit to Russia is being keenly observed by many, including China and US, among the others as well. Remember, it was Prime Minister Narendra Modi who used his diplomatic excellencies and used his diplomatic connections whatsoever that he had when he was safely able to evacuate Indian students stuck in Ukraine during the beginning of the war. Remember, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke to both the Israel president as well as, Ukraine president, as well as the Russian president, and a safe evacuation of the Indian students really happened as well.
Meanwhile, a dispute is brewing in India. It is about jobs, specifically about the jobs data. A tug of war has begun between the Indian government and a private bank. It started last week when economists at Citibank made some big claims about India's job market. They released a report with 3 key highlights. Number 1, India is not creating enough jobs. According to Citibank, India needs to create 12 million jobs every year, and it needs to keep doing this over the next decade. 12 million every year. This is to absorb the new entrants in the job market. A lot of young people are entering the market. They need jobs. So India must create 12 million vacancies annually. But that's apparently not happening. Even though India is growing at around 7% every year, Citibank says this rate of growth is not enough. Because at the current rate, India will be able to create only 8 to 9 million jobs per year. So they say the country is falling short by at least 3 million. That's the first claim in this report. The second one is about the quality of jobs. Citibank says India needs to create better quality jobs where workers contribute more to the country's economic growth. It points to sectors like agriculture. 46% of India's workforce is engaged in agriculture, 46%, but the sector contributes less than 20% to India's GDP. What about manufacturing? Less than 12% of India's workforce is employed in this sector, so there is scope for improvement here in manufacturing. The third claim is about the pandemic and its impact on jobs. There are fewer workers in the formal sector in India now than there were before the pandemic. The share has fallen from 24% to 21%, meaning just 21% of India's workforce has a job that pays a steady salary or wages. That is the diagnosis of Citibank. It says India needs more jobs and better quality jobs. It also needs more workers employed in the formal sector. And what is India's response? The government has rejected this report. This week, New Delhi issued a rebuttal. It says Citibank did not take into account all the official data released by the government. The statement says, and I quote, "The Ministry of Labour and Employment cautions against the selective use of private data sources that can lead to misleading conclusions about India's employment scenario." Today, India's Reserve Bank, the Reserve Bank of India, published its own jobs data. This is India's central bank. And this data challenges claims made by Citibank. The Indian Central Bank says 46 million Indians joined the workforce last year, and this is the highest increase since the early 1980s. Plus, compared to the previous year, job growth has jumped by almost 6%. So according to the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, the pace of job creation remains robust. Basically, this has become a war of data sets. New Delhi is countering the Citibank report with its own data and numbers. Now, data is a powerful tool to make an argument, and we have no way to independently verify either set. But here's another indicator, and that is the lived experience, which shapes the public sentiment and perception. Take the United States, for instance. Last year, their unemployment rate dropped to 3.4% in the US. 3.4%, it was the lowest in 54 years, a record low in fact. Americans should have been happy about this, but they were not. Multiple surveys showed this, that a majority of Americans felt that their economy was in recession and that America's economic situation was worsening. So while the data shows one picture, it may not have meaningfully impacted people to feel optimistic. And this perception matters too. When fresh graduates struggle to get placed, when existing workers struggle to find jobs, when companies fold up and people are laid off, they tend to question growth numbers. And India has one of the youngest workforces in the world. So while official figures say that there has been job growth, clearly more needs to be done. It is important for policymakers to have an ear to the ground and listen to people more carefully. Our next story is from Jammu and Kashmir, which is witnessing a rise in terrorist activities. Today, an encounter broke out between security forces and terrorists in Doda. This is after an attack on the army yesterday. On Monday, 5 soldiers were killed after terrorists threw grenades and opened fire at an army truck. And these were not the only incidents. 6 terrorists and 2 soldiers were killed in 2 separate encounters in the valley. So who's behind these attacks? The army points at an old culprit. Our next report tells you how cross-border terrorism is threatening Kashmir again.
It was 3:30 p.m. on Monday. The Indian Army was patrolling a road near Badnota village. It's located about 150 kilometers from Kathua. That's when they were ambushed by terrorists. They hurled a grenade and opened fire on army vehicles. 5 soldiers were killed. 6 others were injured.
Injured हमारे पास 5 आए हैं. 5 injured. They are shifted to MH Hospital Pathankot, and 1 dead body is received.
The army retaliated. Security forces returned fire, but the terrorists managed to flee by hiding in the nearby forest. Army officials say 3 terrorists were involved in the attack. Search operations are underway, but it is not the only incident in the region in the last 48 hours. On Sunday, an army camp in Rajouri was attacked. 1 soldier was injured. This happened in the Jammu region. In Kashmir's Kulgam district, 6 terrorists and 2 soldiers were killed in 2 separate encounters over the weekend. The first incident was in Modargam village, where a search operation turned into a gun battle. The second one was in Fruitful. The firefighting there led to the death of a soldier. Another one was injured. These attacks indicate a spike in terror activities in Jammu and Kashmir. Last month, there were 3 terror attacks in 3 days. One attack targeted a bus full of pilgrims. It happened in the Riyasi district. 9 people were killed in the incident. Just 2 days later, 2 armed terrorists entered a village and opened fire, killing a CRPF personnel. So which terror group is responsible for these attacks? Reports suggest it is the Resistance Front. It's a unit of the band Lashkar-e-Toiba. It is believed to be behind the growing terror activities in the Union territory. Last month, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi claimed that the fight against terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir is in its last stage. According to Home Ministry data, 8 civilians have been killed in Jammu and Kashmir in the first 5 months of 2024. So while the deaths may have come down, the latest trend is worrying. And despite overtures of peace offerings, Pakistan continues to bleed Kashmir through its support to these terror groups.
Our next story is about Laos. It's a country in Southeast Asia, the only landlocked country in the region and home to less than 8 million people. Laos is currently in trouble because of debt. And you know what that means? China has ensnared another nation with its debt-trap diplomacy. Let's take a closer look at Laos. It is located in the heart of Southeast Asia mainland. It borders all the countries there: Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand and Myanmar. And to the north of Laos is China, its closest ally and its biggest problem. China has lent a lot of money to Laos, about $10.5 billion. That's about 75% of the country's total public debt, which stands at $13.8 billion, the debt, total debt. Now, the numbers may not sound like a lot, but remember, this is a small nation. This debt amounts to 108% of their GDP, and that is unsustainable. It has resulted in a financial crisis. Last year, their external debt payments reached almost $1 billion, up from about $500 million in 2022. And this is after Laos deferred some of its debt repayments. It has been deferring payments since 2020, since the Wuhan virus pandemic. But despite this, its debt keeps growing, unchecked. So how did it come to this? Well, there are a number of reasons, but there is one major one. Laos is a participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative, the global highway to bankruptcy. Laos agreed to build a high-speed railway as part of the BRI at a cost of $6 billion, and China funded a part of this. But Laos was forced to take a loan for its share. BRI projects have saddled a number of nations with unsustainable debt, and this is the latest example. Another country in China's debt trap. It joins the club made up of nations like Pakistan, Mongolia, Kenya, Zambia, and of course Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt in 2022. You may remember the images, the visuals. Long lines for fuel, a lack of essential goods, no money for imports. and a government in turmoil. Things are settling down in Sri Lanka now, but it is still trying to restructure its debt. Just last week, it struck a deal with private creditors. They agreed to take a 28% haircut. Sri Lanka was lucky here that the creditors agreed to take a loss. But this was not the case with its biggest bilateral creditor, which happens to be China. China too has worked out a deal with Sri Lanka, but it refused to take a haircut. It has eased the terms of repayment, but Colombo will have to pay every penny back over time. So it will take Sri Lanka years to free itself of Chinese debt. China is Sri Lanka's largest bilateral lender, but Beijing accounts for a bit under 45% of Colombo's total debt. That's not the case with Laos. Remember, 75% of Laos's debt is owed to China, and Beijing does not take haircuts. So Laos is staring at decades of paying China back or find an alternative, like selling off critical assets to China. Sri Lanka too had to do this with its China-built Hambantota port that was leased to China for 99 years with the option to extend that lease to 198 years. Basically until long after every Sri Lankan currently alive is gone. Laos may have to go down the same route. Reports say that it is already underway. China now controls some of Laos's electricity infrastructure in exchange for debt relief. Eventually, more Laotian assets may be up for sale. Perhaps even the debt-inducing railway line, which would be both ironic and the perfect example of China's debt trap diplomacy. You may need some time to, pardon the pun, warm up to our next story. If you are in Singapore, get ready for silkworm satay in restaurants or cricket custard on supermarket shelves. Because the island nation has approved insects as food, bugs can now be imported and sold for consumption for both humans and animals. 16 species of insects have the approval, including grasshoppers, moths, crickets, and silkworms. And there is a strict regulatory framework in place. But why does Singapore want bugs on the menu? Are other nations part of this creepy, crawly club? Here's a report.
We hope you're not having dinner right now, but if you are, would you like some bugs with that? The options are endless. How about silkworm satay, maybe chili lime cricket tacos, or grasshopper ganache cake for dessert? Sounds bizarre? Soon these dishes could be on the menu in Singapore. The island nation has given creepy crawlies the green light. In Singapore, insects have been approved as food for consumption by both humans and animals. So don't be shocked if you see mouth-watering mealworms on supermarket shelves, or white grubs as well, grub in restaurants. But can people eat whatever crawls under their beds? Not so much. Singapore has issued a strict regulatory framework. 16 types of insects have been approved for consumption, including certain types of grasshoppers, moths, crickets, silkworms, grubs, and bees. These insects cannot be harvested from the wild. They have to be imported for consumption, then treated to kill any pathogens. But why do the insects need to be imported, and why does Singapore need insects in the first place? The answer lies in Singapore's agricultural landscape. By virtue of its small size, Singapore does not have much of an agriculture sector. It imports 90% of its food, and that's a lot of reliance on other nations. So Singapore wants to change this. It wants to be more self-reliant. This is the city-state's 30 by 30 goal. It wants to have 30% of the nutritional needs met locally by 2030. But the pickup will take a while. In the meantime, Singapore has an alternate strategy. It wants to diversify, hence the insects. Their import will reduce the burden on the Singaporean food industry. This may be a challenge as well. After all, eating insects is a novelty in Singapore, but the government hopes the nutritional value of bugs will have some appeal. Many insects, especially crickets, grasshoppers and mealworms, are rich in protein. They contain plenty of antioxidants and minerals, and Singapore is not alone in saying this. The United Nations is appealing to the public to accept bugs as food because they come with two benefits. First, they are packed with nutrients. Secondly, they are a sustainable source of food. Insect rearing emits fewer greenhouse gases, so bugs can help us in the battle against climate change. A lot of benefits here, which is why some nations are warming up to the idea, including the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea and Thailand. They have all allowed the consumption of insects, and different nations have their own favorites. In Japan, there's a tradition of eating grasshoppers. Grasshopper tacos are a delicacy in Mexico. Ants, crickets and tarantulas are commonly eaten in Thailand and Cambodia. So if you can get past the initial creepy vibes of the creepy crawlies, it may serve you well to warm up to the idea of insects as food.
Modi's first visit ever since he became the Prime Minister, out of the country. He's gone on a diplomatic visit as well. So obviously it's a very important visit given the fact that there's going to be the discussion of the Ukraine war also, which is going to be on the agenda, because the Indian government is always in the opinion that war is not the solution for anything else, and we are not in a condition to wage war as well. So of course other key issues including defense and the fact that India has been buying its petrol from Russia has also been on the watch for many countries, especially in the West as well. So all these discussions will be extremely important as Prime Minister Narendra Modi continues with his visit. Of course, he had a first. He landed there yesterday. He had a one-to-one meeting with President Putin yesterday, and the results are already there for people to see. There are many Indian families who wanted their people to be back, given the fact that several Indians had laid down their lives, had in fact suffered because of the war in Ukraine, and basically they were converted into soldiers for the Russian army, but they will now be returned back to India. That's of course a huge diplomatic coup as far as India is concerned.
Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is currently in Russia, sojourn, landed in Moscow on Monday evening, and upon his arrival in Moscow, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was accorded Guard of Honor at the airport itself. Russia's first Deputy Prime Minister, Denis Manturov, received Prime Minister Modi at the airport, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin hosted Prime Minister Modi at his countryside residence in Moscow. Now, Prime Minister Modi and Putin were seen shaking hands as well. Today, the Prime Minister is going to meet the Indian diaspora, after which the first leg of his 3-day visit will come to an end, and the Prime Minister will then leave for Austria, which will also mark the first trip by any Indian Prime Minister to the country in last 41 years.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Kim Jong-un marks his grandfather, North Korean founder Kim Il-sung's death anniversary with a concert. In Spain, 2 people were left injured on the 3rd day of Pamplona's annual bull run. And Sicily's only natural lake is disappearing as the island grapples with drought. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1877, the first Wimbledon championship was held. The first edition only had a men's singles tournament. In 1884, a women's championship was introduced. The Wimbledon